It's my very great pleasure today to welcome Professor Mark Thompson, somebody who many people in this room have read for some time, others may be less so. But your information, Mark is currently the Director of the Southeast Asia Research Centre at the City University of Hong Kong, where he's also acting Head of Politics in the Department of Asian and International Studies. Prior to that, he's worked at various universities in the UK, Germany, Asia and the United States, including as a fellow, and that includes as the Lee Kong Chan Distinguished Fellow for Southeast Asian Studies at Stanford University and the National University of Singapore between 2008 and 2009, just to give you one example of some of his visiting professorships. Mark's research area centres around issues of comparative politics, particularly democratisation, non-democratisation, with a special focus on Southeast Asia, which is what he's going to be looking at today. He's published a great many influential articles along these themes in such prominent journals across the social sciences as Comparative Politics, Third World Quarterly, Theory and Society, Current History, and the Journal of Developing Society. Of course, his most substantial works are his books, which include The Anti-Marcos Struggle, Personalistic Rule and Democratic Transition in the Philippines, published by the prestigious Yale University Press in 1995, but reproduced at least in 2 other editions since, underlining its importance. And I can certainly say that for my own work, it's been immensely helpful and insightful. Subsequent books include Democratic Revolutions, Asia and Eastern Europe, published in 2004 by Routledge, and forthcoming book, Authoritarian Modernism in East Asia with Murdoch. Among his current projects is fascinating work with his Southeast Asia Research Centre colleague Stefan Ortman on the significance of Singapore as a political regime model for China. This has already produced an essay this year in the Journal of Democracy, and another one in 2014 in the Pacific Review. Today he's going to talk to us about democracy and its discontents in Southeast Asia, obviously against a backdrop of a considerable corpus of work of a comparative nature, not just within Southeast Asia but beyond. And it is an intrinsically important question, of course, but it's one with wider resonance of the theorisation of political regimes and their directions everywhere, not least because we've heard in recent times that the newly elected president of the Philippines has been described as the Trump of the East. So discontent with existing political regimes is not unique to Asia or Southeast Asia. So in the discussion time, I'm sure there'll be plenty of opportunity to push as broadly as possible about the theoretical approach that Mark will be developing today to explain how we can understand what's happening in Southeast Asia. Thank you very much, Mark. You've got about 40 minutes and then we'll open up for questions.
Thanks very much, Gary, for those warm remarks. Thanks to the Asia Research Center for this invitation, and very pleased to be here for several reasons, blue skies being one, rare in Hong Kong, many friends in the audience, people I've known, or at least whose work I've followed for many years. The Asia Research Center and the Southeast Asia Research Center at CityU have a lot of overlap. We've had common directors. Directors here have also been directors there. Kevin Lewison. I just was talking to Commissioner yesterday about his time at CERC about 10 years ago. So there's quite a bit of overlap, and it's great to finally have a chance to come out here. And when Gary written me about coming over, I'd thought about this comparative topic on democratization. Also, I talked to Terence about this and fell on board in February. But little did I realize how relevant it would become, and my timing comes out to be impeccable because, as Gary mentioned, we have the rise of what perhaps we could call neo-authoritarianism in the Philippines, and something that we've seen recently in the Indonesian presidential election, a close call there anyway, and of course something that's been in power in Thailand for the last couple of years. So I want to address those kind of issues today. If you were wondering why I put Freud on my first slide, well, I'm going to try to make a sort of Freudian take on this idea of discontents, arguing that there's a tension in electoral politics in Southeast Asia between primordial interests of elites and the middle class base and the dictates of liberal, particularly with emphasis on human rights, democracy, the concern about the election of pro-poor politicians. Incidentally, I hadn't realized that I'm using PowerPoint, I'm going to have everybody turning away. But in any case, we're all committed to PowerPoint. Power corrupts, but PowerPoint corrupts absolutely sometimes. So I'm going to suggest that there's a paradox here, because if we look at the origins of the recent democratic transitions, or at least to electoral democracy, that they had a elite middle class or bourgeois origin, but because they have not delivered the good governance goods, sometimes instead helping what elites consider bad populists power, that the privileged have moved for that reason, but also others, to undermine democracy. So we see this most obviously in Thailand, where after a brief flirtation with what Michael Connors has called royal liberalism, the network monarchy has the loose alliance of the business, the military, and the monarchy itself, has repeatedly couped against the populist, pro-Thaksin governments, which had been strongly backed by poor voters, and whenever elections had been held after the first coup in 2007, after the quasi-coup of 2008, then again in 2011, the pro-Thaksin parties have won easily, overwhelmingly, and now since 2014 we have a military government, one of the most repressive in recent history of Thailand, probably the most repressive since the coup of 1976. So neo-authoritarianism in Thailand is justified by corruption charges against Thaksin, his sister, and their collaborators, and the claim that they've abused power. But arguably the key reason why these governments were so controversial and posed such a threat was they could not be defeated electorally, either through the massive use of patronage nor for calls for good governance. In the Philippines, we see democratic oscillation. Besides the recent victory of Duterte, which I'll talk about more in a little bit, you had the overthrow of Joseph Estrada. Again, somebody used this pro-poor populist narrative. In 2001, his fellow movie star, actor, politician, friend, Fernando Jr. was cheated in the 2004 elections. His daughter just lost the current elections, coming in third. So pro-poor populist politicians were also pushed aside in the Philippines a little bit more subtly than in Thailand. And populism was also not as sustained in the Philippines. Good governance, reformist narrative was revived alongside, of course, patronage politics with the election of Benigno Aquino. That was 6 years ago, 2010. But now things have changed again in this recent presidential election just this Monday. And interestingly, in Indonesia, where, of course, according to some of the basic theories about the chances for democratic survival, the country should not have very good prospects, having a lower per capita income, having greater ethnic fragmentation, and so on. Interestingly, electoral democracy has proved most stable. On the one hand, in terms of consistent support for elections. Wahi was removed in 2001, but that was constitutional. And parliamentary and since 2004 presidential elections have been free and fair. And one interesting thing that I'll be pointing to is the ability of Indonesian elites to rejuvenate a kind of good governance narrative. It was in SPDA's first term that we saw this, and then in Jokowi's election just 2 years ago. And you see a kind of tenuous balance, which is seemingly paradoxical, but in Indonesia has been successful thus far, between, on the one hand, party cartelization of patronage, and on the other hand, reformist institutions, particularly the anti-corruption agency in Indonesia. So a very interesting balancing act. And Prabowo, who I suggest Duterte had a kind of tough guy, neo-authoritarian narrative, was only narrowly defeated in the 2014 election, but his so-called red-white alliance, which tried to oppose the Jacobi presidency in the early months, eventually collapses largely due to patronage considerations. So the approach I'm going to take today involves, as you can see, a comparison across electoral Southeast Asia with a focus on Thailand, the Philippines, and Indonesia. I will offer a very brief and probably unsatisfactory analysis of Singapore, Malaysia, and Myanmar at the end. I'm going to be synthesizing a lot of recent Southeast Asia electoral politics literature. I'll be citing a bit of it, but you'll see references elsewhere. There is a rich literature, which somebody like myself interested in this comparative theme can draw on. So I'm acknowledging here the importance of a number of authors. I've just listed a few of them here. With a somewhat different emphasis, I'm going to talk in terms of narratives, strategic groups, the kind of plot that narratives involve in terms of convincing a mass audience of the plausibility of this way of looking at politics. And I'm also going to suggest that this allows us to consider structural factors, because that affects the nature and the success of what one could call a narrative performance. My argument is that the elite narrative of liberal reformism united key strategic groups, politicians, big business, communal elites, non-government organization activists, and the hierarchy of the military, initially and against dictatorship in the early years after a transition to electoral democracy. But there have been, because of the internal contradictions of reformism, particularly between patronage on the one hand and reliance on good governance discourse on the other, as well as the persistence of poverty despite promises of inclusive growth, have allowed for, on the one hand, the rise of a counter-narrative, the pro-poor populist one, appealing to disadvantaged voters, and on the other hand, a kind of neo-authoritarian peace and order narrative, which is, I'm going to suggest, is a radicalization of reformism, sort of reformism without the liberal elements, stressing discipline over democracy, sometimes used to counter the populist challenge or out of disillusionment with the seeming weakness of reformist efforts. The idea of narratives is quite popular in a number of different fields at the moment, in literature and also in philosophy. I find the work of Paul Ricoeur particularly insightful in this regard, where he talks about how narratives inform the way individuals act and interpret the world. And he turns from individual to we narratives, in which these narratives are brought together. One advantage of this approach, he suggests, is that it helps us avoid unnecessarily reductionist theories of the self, which is mere products of the unconscious, or the will to power, or the forces of production. It puts the focus on political action, and narratives are involved in a kind of plot, as he says, or plotment is the word he uses, in which a kind of story is told that may or may not be persuasive to individuals or a group. Now here, obviously, I'm interested in political narratives, and there have been a number of authors who have taken this approach. Some of you may have heard of the work of Lakoff, the cognitive psychologist, who has, in particular in the US electoral context, talked about how politics is not about rational argument, it's more about moral, mythic, and emotional appeals, which he calls narratives. These narratives are created in the course of political action. They're not merely constructs, mere manipulations. They have to arise in a certain context, have a certain plausibility. But that does not, of course, mean that they don't involve particular interests that are represented through these narratives, and of course that these narratives are used to legitimate political action. Elite narratives arise within an overall national story, and therefore it depends a lot on the cultural resources available, and therefore when we're talking about these different cases, of course, we have to accept that there will be important differences in the narratives in the Thai context, where, as many of you will know, there's this strong discourse of Thai uniqueness. There's the special case of Spanish-American influence alongside, of course, Malay cultural factors in the Philippines, and in Indonesia there's often mention of the Adat tradition, among other factors. So there will be these national characteristics, and of course, the construct of the nation. In a way, a story gets told about the nation. Within that, you'll have political narratives being told. But I'm going to assume here that there are certain patterns that we can compare across Southeast Asia. And those are the patterns I'll be talking about. I'm also interested in strategic groups. This is the work of the sociologists Hans-Dieter Evers and Thomas Schiele several decades ago, who distinguished these strategic groups, and they had a particular focus on Southeast Asia according to appropriation strategies, but also the kind of political base they have. So here I'll be distinguishing politicians' patronage, of course, and their ability to appeal to voters, big businesses' control of capital and its employees, communalist elites, by which I mean Muslim leaders in Indonesia, the Catholic Church primarily in the Philippines, and the Buddhist monarchy alliance in Thailand. They will have a kind of ethno-religious base. Civil society activists are very reliant in the region on international funding and use liberalist norms and have a strong middle-class constituency, whereas the military hierarchy has, at least theoretically speaking, a monopoly on coercion in the Bavarian sense and has its ordinary soldiers as its base. Narratives fit into social structure in terms of the kind of performance which can be more or less plausible according to the prevailing social cleavages in the country. I would argue that good governance and neo-authoritarian narratives resonate best across class lines, while pro-poor narratives are more along class lines. But when there's a major cross-cutting ethno-religious and regional cleavage, this will make populist appeals, for example, more difficult. How well a narrative can be performed also varies according to the level of development. Relatively higher levels of development in the region will create a larger middle-class base for elite narratives, allowing more militant middle-class mobilization, but also helping sustain populist movements, as we'll see in Thailand. Okay, just to talk briefly about the individual cases, in terms of a kind of chronological approach, because I'm arguing these narratives are sequentially arranged. I begin with the Reformasi movements, not just in Indonesia in 1997-98, but also earlier in the Philippines in 1986, and in Thailand you can point both to 1973, the uprising then, student-led, or the 1992 Black Friday protests. So these are all protests against dictatorships in which you have a theme of, as it was articulated in the Indonesian case, of collusion, corruption, and nepotism. And in the Philippine and Indonesian case, it also occurs during economic crisis. These protests tend to be initiated by middle-class activists, particularly members of NGOs and student groups, as well as labor groups, particularly important in the Thai case in 1992 and 1973. They draw backing from alienated members of the business elite, those upset about cronyism. You can see this quite clearly in the Philippines in the early part of the 1980s, leading up to the 1983 assassination of Aquino, but elsewhere in Indonesia, for example, as well. Communalist groups, which have long collaborated with the regime, suddenly change. In the Philippines, it was called critical collaboration by the Catholic Church. All of a sudden, they became part of the opposition after 1983. It's less abrupt in Thailand, but you can also see the rise of what Robert Hefner called civil Islam in Indonesia. A number of studies done about how Islamic leaders adopted a democratically oriented, liberal, reformist discourse in the 1990s. And then finally and decisively, there are defections in the military hierarchy which seal the fate of these regimes. After a transition to electoral democracy, you see the rise of what I'm calling liberal reformism. And the basis of this narrative is they have, the problem, source of evil here is seen as these corrupt dictatorships and corruption generally. And so that is made the center of the discourse. One of the problems, of course, from the very beginning is these politicians themselves are quite reliant on patronage. So how is it that you can be a representative of good governance when you're involved in patronage-driven politics? That's a dilemma that's never resolved, and one of the weaknesses of this narrative, as I mentioned. In the case of Thailand in 1992, you had this discourse of angels and devils, the angels being reformists, the devils being the old-style politicians. And this was institutionalized in the reformist constitution of 1997 in Thailand. In the post-Marcos context, there was also a new constitution, and with the victory, although whether he actually won the election is another issue, but the supposed victory of Fidel Ramos in the 1992 elections, you had a candidate who had campaigned on a reformist platform, who brought in a lot of technocrats, and who was seen as one of the most reformist-minded of the post-Marcos presidents. Wahid's an interesting case because arguably he had a strong reformist agenda, but there were also major patronage scandals which his opponents used to remove him from office in 2001. And whereas Megawati promised reform, she was very much relying on patronage instead. But there were constitutional changes during this period, and very significant, of course, is the establishment of what is arguably the strongest anti-corruption commission in the region in Indonesia. Then you have the rise of the populist challenge in the Philippines and Thailand. Here a picture of the two major populist politicians, Estrada, the movie star turned politician, and Thaksin, who, whereas Estrada was kind of a natural populist, who could sort of convert his movie fans into his voters, Thaksin's populism was more constructed, more inadvertent. It's a very interesting discussion of this by Pastor Baker and how Thaksin is kind of forced into this role of populism after he loses elite support. I argued that these populists successfully circumvented old patronage networks through direct appeals to voters, bypassing local politicians and forcing them into their alliance with them, otherwise they would be marginalized electorally, and centralizing patronage thereby. Using pro-poor rhetoric, and in the case of Thaksin, actual programs that arguably were of great benefit to the poor, of course the healthcare scheme, but also the 1 million baht given to villages. I've done a little research into what Estrada did in his 3 years in power, and there were more populist-oriented programs than people commonly realize, but given a short time in office, also in terms of land reform, but given a short time in office, they did not get very far, and they were quickly reversed by his successor, Royal. They won landslide victories over old-style politicians, angering key elite strategic groups. Estrada, from the very beginning, was hated by basically all major elite groups in the Philippines. In Thaksin's case, it took a while, but slowly but surely, he also aroused the wrath of the privileged in Thailand. Involving civil society, big business, and military hierarchy. It's very, very striking, for example, in Thailand, how the well-intentioned civil society elites were at the forefront of this anti-democratic movement. One of the strongest advocates of his removal by whatever means from office. Populists also fuel ethnic conflict in both countries. This is sort of a footnote, but an interesting one, in which ethnic conflict in the south in both countries, Muslim secessionist conflict is fueled by their kind of macho promises of law and order. You have a what could be called the people power putsch in the Philippines. They call it EDSA dos. The people power in the Philippines is called EDSA because of the street on which it took place. And so the second EDSA, according to this view, was in 2001, again due to a corrupt president, they say. The difference, of course, this time is that that corrupt president was legally elected. So there was mobilization in the name of civil society, but actually it was, in this case, quite different than the people power uprising in 1986, much more focused on the elite and the middle class, with ultimately military backing that leads to Estrada's overthrow. This occurs in Thailand in the protests of 2006, and then the military coup that occurs several months after that. And again, of course, the protests that take place in late 2013, starting in late 2013, after the Shinawatra tries to push through an amnesty law, which would benefit her brother, among others. These protests continue until there's the military coup in May of 2014. So you have these kind of, under the guise of civil society rising up against tries in Thailand. 2008 is not commonly recognized as a coup, but if you look closely, it really was. This is also when the airport was occupied as part of that civilian protest to increase pressure on the Thompson regime. The rise of neo-authoritarians. So if we look back at the Thai case, arguably there was also kind of a figure like this in Thailand, actually several. But the first one you could probably point to is Chong Long, who is a very interesting character, one of the young Turks, a military rebel involved in a number of coup attempts in the 1980s, who reinvents himself as a political reformist, becomes mayor of Bangkok and governor of Bangkok, excuse me, and organizes a political party, of which, by the way, Thaksin Shinawatra is one of the early members. So they were actually allied at one point. But then he again changes his political stripes, turning against Thaksin when he becomes prime minister and one of the leaders of the protests that take place initially in 2006, but then again at later dates. So for example, in 2008, there were a number of other figures who could be termed neo-authoritarian as well, the most recent, of course, being prime leader of the current military junta. In the case of Indonesia, I would suggest Prabowo Subianto is misspelled, sorry, is nearly won the Indonesian presidency in 2014, refusing to disavow his authoritarian past and his lukewarm attitude, to put it mildly, toward elections generally, winning over particularly urban middle-class voters. And then Duterte's recent campaign, pledging to eradicate corruption and promising to crack down on crime, making this sort of strange electoral pledge that he will get rid of crime entirely in 3 to 6 months, killing tens of thousands of criminals extrajudicially in the process. He threatened to abolish the Congress, and the courts, as well as human rights activists, would face pressure if they dared stand in the way of his cleanup. And as I've tried to show in some recent pieces I've written for several blogs, along with the Philippine colleague Julio Tianqi, I've suggested that if you look at the way Duterte rises in the opinion polls, besides the regional story, which is interesting, moving from the south to the north, an unusual candidate coming from southern Mindanao, there's also the changing class composition of the support. And initially it's highly concentrated in the middle and lower middle class, and only at the very end of the campaign does it spread to other social classes, but remains weakest, for example, among the very poorest voters in the Philippines. I've talked about social cleavages, so if we talk about Thailand, the interesting point is that whereas you have strong class cleavages like in the Philippines, you also have regional ones, but in this case they reinforce the class cleavages, more or less. If you think about Thailand, basically, including parts of central Thailand and the north and northeast, Isan, are strongly pro-Thaksin. These are also the poorest parts of the country. Bangkok, the wealthiest part, and the south, which is the wealthiest region outside of Bangkok, you have strong anti-Thaksin elements. So the two ideas, the two cleavages are overlapping. The Democrat Party has its base in the south as well. So that gives the a regional side to this yellow-red story, which is also, of course, one of different social classes. A scholar who works for the Friedrich Ebert from Mark Saxer has talked about a transformation trap in Thailand, in which you have middle-income peasants. These are terms used by other scholars, or urbanized villagers, demanding greater participation and access to the modern economy. This in turn frustrates the middle class, which is angered by the populist handouts to these relatively poor people and the kind of electoral monopoly these populists achieve. And in the case of Thailand, they back the network monarchy's reactionary political course. This ends the final, or at the moment, final round of populism in Thailand. One of the fascinating things about Thailand, if you look at the literature, there was this argument that Thai political parties are quite weak. With the new, part of it is the change in the constitution, which gives incentives toward strengthening parties, making defections more difficult. other factors that strengthen parties, but arguably because of Thompson's very effective populist appeals and because he had these social structural roots regionally and in terms of social position in society, this made his party so strong that they could actually abolish the party. They abolished it twice. You could rename the party and it would still win the elections. And then his final incarnation was led by his sister, Murdoch, and she easily won the 2011 elections. And this is despite the massive advantages that the military has in terms of patronage, setting the rules. 2007, they also won, even though the military was engaged in low-level forms of intimidation. But now we have this very repressive coup, perhaps learning the lesson from the past that it wasn't enough. And now we have a clearly electoral authoritarian constitutional draft on offer. There's also this kind of reactionary communalist reaction in terms of discussions about how Thaksin is untying, goes against prevailing cultural traditions in Thailand. You have the use of lèse-majesté charges to go after opponents of the regime, and arguably under this new military order, the military-monarchy alliance is tightened further. The Philippine case, after the overthrow of Estrada, he was jailed for several years. The cheating of Fernando Poe Jr. in 2004, you had the unpopular Arroyo regime, in part because of this, the aftermath of this revelation that there had been cheating in the 2004 election. And this enables this fellow here, the still sitting president of the Philippines, Benigno Aquino, Noy, to easily win the 2010 elections. And he uses what in my view is a classic liberal reformist narrative that had Ramos and his mother, Cory Aquino, had used before him. The other factor I suggest for the ability of reformists to revive their standing in the Philippines, unlike in Thailand, where the Democrats had been consistent electoral losers since the early 1990s, despite their liberal reformist agenda, is the weakness of populism in terms of its ability to institutionalize and sustain itself. So when Arroyo engages in what could be apostasy toward the reformist agenda with her scandals and electoral manipulation, and with the death of Cory Aquino, quickly dubbed St. Cory and put forward as a nominated actually by the Philippine Catholic Church for a saint. So her process of her sainthood is going through the Catholic Church bureaucracy. So maybe if some of us live long enough, we'll live to see Cory Aquino become a saint. That this sets the stage for her son, Benigno Aquino, a good dynasty. One of the interesting things about the Philippines is dynasties are bad except when they're good. All of a sudden, in this case, it was good because he inherited his mother's positive characteristics, supposedly, her honesty, and he was able to use that successfully as a foil against Arroyo, even though she was not running, but her candidates, and winning by the biggest plurality of any election since the fall of Marcos. But reformism, arguably in the Philippines, raised expectations it couldn't ultimately fulfill. And one of, I think, the crucial turning points that many people would suggest the first half of the Aquino presidency, 2013, was successful. There are a number of things you can point to, many of them symbolic, the jailing of his predecessor, Gloria Macapagal Arroyo. She's not under house arrest, she's under hospital arrest. She's quite ill, but she's being detained in the hospital. The Supreme Court Chief Justice was removed on rather dubious charges, so there were this sort of symbolic acts claiming that he was corrupt. There were some changes in the way projects were allocated to make them more transparent, but that led to the cancellation of a number of infrastructure initiatives, which have been criticized. And there was also the Reproductive Health Act passed just at the very end of Aquino's first term, which people saw as a sign of real change, because it was actually willing to go against the conservative Catholic Church on this issue. Although, sadly, this program has actually been blocked by the lack of funding in Congress. But beginning in the second term, a series of problems arose, and the greatest one, the one that's most fundamental for the reformist agenda was the so-called pork barrel scandal, which led to a number of protests in Manila, which proved to be short-lived, but kind of symbolized the dissatisfaction with the lack of systematic reform. I mean, here's a president who comes in saying, I'm going to change things, trust me, I'm honest, and one of the things that's kept him personally popular, there have been no scandals directly related to him or his family, at least that have been publicized. So he's seen as personally honest, but this lack of systematic reform and his unwillingness to quickly distance himself from pork barrel. So my point is that if you look closely at the way the Aquino administration operated, and its biggest successes were due to a success in allocating patronage within Congress to get Corona, the Supreme Court justice, impeached, or to get the reproductive health bill through. And yet it turns out this pork barrel is being abused, and it's not surprising. Some of Aquino's political enemies are targeted and jailed because of this. None of his friends are interested in it. But this weakens his credibility. So I think this was a very important stage in the weakening of the reformist narrative in the Philippines. Despite rapid growth, you also have continued high poverty levels, unemployment levels. Basically, growth has been benefiting the elites, the 40 top families, as well as more marginally parts of the middle class, but there are large groups of Filipinos who left out. So from the very beginning, his would-be successor, Rojas, who held a number of government positions and portrayed himself as a reformer. Even on the ballot, his name was not just Mar Rojas, it was Mar, the straight path of reform Rojas, which did not manage to move him above the 20% level of support they had from the very beginning of the campaign. It didn't budge. He's wound up coming second, but this is after sort of wild gyrations. First it was the pro-poor populist Binay, who was up, but he was damaged by a major corruption scandal in his home city of Makati, where he'd been mayor for several decades. Then there was Grace Poe, but she had the citizenship problems. And finally, it was Duterte who moves up with this call for peace and order, echoing, interestingly, the call for discipline that Marcos made in the early 1970s, justifying the declaration of martial law. Duterte spoken warmly about Marcos, the need to restore discipline in the country, and of course, in the vice presidential race, the son of Marcos, Bongbong Marcos, one of the more unusual nicknames you'll come across. He is neck and neck with Mar Rojas is running the vice presidency is elected separately in the Philippines. We could also talk a bit about the Philippine electoral system, one of the stranger ones, with no runoff system either. But she's running neck and neck with Marcos, who still will, in the end, due to absentee ballots, become vice president. Symbolizing, of course, this neo-authoritarian turn in the Philippines, which I argue has been fueled by lower middle class anger at criminality and corruption, the promises of reform, the promises of change. It's the head of the National Police Commission. There's a perception that there's a crime wave. Sorry, Rojas was the head of the National Police Commission, so he gets the blame for that. He gets blamed for not being strong enough in the rehabilitation efforts after Typhoon Haiyan in late 2013, and so on. So this is sort of the context in which this new authoritarian narrative emerges. And then, as I mentioned, rejuvenated reformism in Indonesia. If you want to go back to the early parts of the transition, of course, the ethnic violence, the kind of chaos that seemed to follow Suharto's fall, and yet this subsides as early as 2002, and there's growing consensus in the country. So when we think of Indonesia as the most stable democracy, it's astounding, among other reasons, because of just how unstable it seemed just a little over 10 years ago. One of the key factors many scholars have pointed to is the establishment of an effective patronage cartel, which many of the elites from the Suharto era are back. They're becoming major political players. But at the same time, and this is something that I think is fascinating about the Indonesian case, you get these strategic groups backing reformism, and presidential candidates like, as I said, SBA in his initial run in 2004, and of course Jokowi in 2014, using this reformist narrative. Even though there have been a number of failures, clearly Megawati was not a very reformist president, and by the end of his second term, SBA was quite very much a discredited reformist. This, I think, helps set the stage for Prabowo's campaign in 2014, rather than pro-poor appeals, pro-poor populist appeals, like I've seen elsewhere. But because of Jokowi's narrow victory, and despite the sort of disappointment many people feel feel about his presidency, arguably it hasn't affected the democratic stability of the country. Why is this? Well, I think one factor is there's no easily mobilizable class cleavage in Indonesia. Now, there's been a lot of discussion of so-called politik aliran in Indonesia. Many scholars are pointing to the fact that it's much weaker now than it was in the 1950s, that societal polarization is no longer so central. You have the Filipinization of parties, according to one scholar on this, Ufin. That's all true, but seen comparatively, you have still enough of a split between more secularly oriented nationalist politicians and more Islamic oriented politicians and other parties, that there is a quasi-ethno-religious cleavage in Indonesia, which still has electoral impact and arguably helps cross-cut class cleavages. So if we're trying to explain why there's been no strong pro-populist candidate emerging in Indonesia, polarizing Indonesian politics like it did, like Thompson did in Thailand or Estrada did in the Philippines, I think that's one factor we need to look at. It also explains then why instead you would get, on the one hand, the strong reformist campaigns, and then the answer to that would not be populism, but it propose a neo-authoritarian narrative, which is only narrowly defeated, and his attempts to block Jacobi ultimately dissolved through redistributions of patronage. So as promised, I want to talk about the other electoral cases. Najib is not too worried, it seems, although maybe he should be. Singapore, if we want to look at Singapore in the kind of framework I've just presented, we could see it as the most successful electoral authoritarian regime in the region, in part because the ruling PAP still retains some, anyway, of its reformist narrative. Of course, many scholars, including Gary and others, have pointed to the Terrence have pointed to the problems the PAP has had, also some of its electoral setbacks. But if you look at these things comparatively again, the way that PAP can still present themselves as, quote, the men in white is quite striking compared to the lack of a strong reformist image of other politicians around the region. This has been buttressed by an interesting shift in PAP policy recently, adopting some more populist measures, so that kind of mixture of reformism and populism, something that Marcos had tried in the 1970s in the Philippines, was so hard to have in Indonesia, has been very effective, particularly, of course, in the last election, which may be a bit of a one-off, Lee Kuan Yew's death and the 50th anniversary of Singapore, but nonetheless, clearly the PAP is in a rather strong position at the very moment. Malaysia, by contrast, the ruling UMNO has lost its reformist legitimacy. Some might suggest it never really had it, given the obvious importance of patronage politics in UMNO. What is it except a patronage party? But after the Reformasi protests following the 1998 economic crisis, you did have the, relatively speaking, reformist regime of Abdullah Badawi, but those efforts run out of steam, and then when the Najib becomes prime minister, and with the 1MDB scandal, any sort of reformist pretensions are gone. But he's able, of course, to cling to power through this concentration of patronage. I'm just suggesting in a comparative context, when you just have to use patronage openly and without really any sort of reformist legitimacy, that puts you in a rather vulnerable position. And finally, in Myanmar, this quite amazing and surprising transition for many that's just occurred in the last few months. One could view this as a regime concession. It's been a part of the military plan, the new constitution, the elections being set up, and the military has actually followed its own roadmap in that regard, as there was a power change at the top of the junta. This was due to the failures of authoritarian developmentalism and a 25-year-long opposition reformist campaign. I mean, basically, Aung San Suu Kyi and the National League for Democracy get the same percentage of the vote, more or less, in 2015 as they got in 1990. So it's a campaign that continues over a long period of time. And so viewed comparatively, they're still at the early reformist stage. And what will happen afterwards, based on what we've seen in other countries, is unlikely to be very easy. In sum, then what I'm arguing is that the reformist narrative has failed in the electoral cases of Southeast Asia. Populism has been defeated, at least temporarily, and you've seen the rise of neo-authoritarianism. So in Thailand, this neo-authoritarian coup, after Thompson's successful mobilization of the poor as his electorate, and his populist movement was sustained in part due to the higher development levels in Thailand, you could argue. On the other hand, of course, it also led to a radicalization of the larger middle class. Reformism has had a very mixed record in the class-divided but poorer Philippines. Populism was successfully defeated, it seems, and reformism revived in 2010, but now we've seen middle-class-driven neo-authoritarianism in the last election. And finally, reformists have seen most successful in Indonesia, with cross-class appeals, and this despite the continued importance of patronage and the weakness of the Jokowi administration. But the strength of Prabowo's new authoritarian appeals 2 years ago suggests that this kind of challenge could arise again in the near future. Thank you very much.
Okay, we're open for questions.
Earlier in your presentation, you mentioned that Duterte liked the narrative of discipline over democracy. I'm just wondering, based on this narrative lens of looking at the recent elections in the Philippines, how do we reconcile then what analysts say that there was a historical and a promising engagement of Duterte with Duterte's local government with marginalized communist groups in southern Philippines, and such as the Moros and the Nuas, and liberation movements such as the Moro Islamic Liberation Front and the Communist Party in the Philippines. So while there is this narrative that, as we were saying, that he prioritizes discipline over democracy, what has been seen on his administration in Southern Philippines seems to be more layered than that. So, yeah, the main question for me is, how does the narrative framework reconcile this?
Thank you. That's an important question. Duterte is indeed more than just that. Discipline over democracy. Although I think if you look at Duterte in the national context, that was the narrative most people followed. And you know, even though he's got this anti-imperial Manila side to his campaign that made him so strong in Davao area in particular, but in Mindanao generally, and then going up to the size, particularly among Cebuano voters, he also did well in Manila. And he did well in Manila not because of these things you mentioned, but because people wanted to restore order, get rid of the criminals, and the perception of the rising crime and the threat that the modest prosperity that the small shop owners, the overseas workers, the taxi drivers, and so on and so forth, that made them such adamant supporters of Duterte. So I think there is that national appeal, and that goes far beyond these local elements you mentioned. The interesting thing, though, is these local elements may have an impact on his presidency. And if one to be optimistic, and one would like to be optimistic, but looking closely at Duterte, also if you look more carefully at the kind of people behind this campaign, Bobby Tiglao has been talking about that recently in the Middle of Times, one of the most insightful columnists, even if quite vindictive and still pro-royal. He's been talking a lot about who is behind Duterte. So there's some fairly dubious players behind him. But if you want to make an optimistic case, you could say, well, he's a federalist, and this is part of an ongoing. There've been some efforts to decentralize the Philippines away from this Manila-centric political model. That's probably a good thing. That will open a can of worms when he has a constitutional convention and the issue of parliamentarianism comes up, with a strengthening of the presidency, and if he worries that he'll use this convention to increase his powers even further. And he's already talked about being a despot, so let's see what happens if something like that. One could also argue that because he's from Mindanao, he understands the importance of peace in the area, that the MILF deal, which was very close before the massacre in January, that finally pushes through. I think that's likely. That would be positive. The ties to the communist rebels are fascinating. Joma Sisam, the perhaps most high-profile Maoist still around, has now told Duterte he wants to talk. And this is a very interesting phenomenon. Even though, of course, there was a big fight over Davao between private armies and the communists in the mid-1980s, around the time of the political transition in Manila, Duterte has managed to maintain warmer ties. Of course, some people accuse him of being a communist, that's not true. He has some advisors. But there are possibilities of some sort of negotiations. And that, again, also would likely be a positive thing. He'll raise some worries in the military, which is going to be a crucial part of his strategy to consolidate power. And he's also already talked about raising military salaries, for example. So anyway, I remain skeptical about Duterte, though. Anybody who says, I'm going to abolish democratic institutions, I'm going to kill people extrajudicially, doesn't strike me as the most convinced Democrat I've ever come across. And people could say, oh, he understands Muslim secessionism, and now he's got a reasonable attitude towards insurgency, but he's also clearly not a Democrat. So we'll have to see how effective pressures are on keeping him from his non-democratic instincts. Another very important element, very interesting, is the human rights community, which has been very strong and very strongly institutionalized in the Philippines, but didn't speak out strongly against Duterte. And that's an interesting question, why not? There are a few individuals who did, but it was too little and it was too late. One argument is some of the human rights community has been very focused on political crimes, particularly, for example, during the Arroyo presidency, when killings of people suspected of communist sympathies rose dramatically. And because Duterte is talking about criminals, killed criminals, that's okay somehow. I had an interesting discussion with Jackie Baker, who can't be here today, about the way that goes on in Jakarta. Those kind of things clearly go on in Manila as well, but he wants to sort of make that more systematic. And, or you can think of Thaksin's war on drugs in 2004. So that kind of thing is very worrisome. There is the National Commission on Human Rights, Chito Gascon, who I know quite well, will have a really tough job trying to deal with that situation. But I'm not overly optimistic, sorry. That's a long-winded way to say that. But
Thank you. Dick Robertson?
Yeah, I think that this idea of a new sort of challenger in politics in Southeast Asia, the neo-authoritarianism, the appeal to law and order, which attracts people from a range of classes. I think it's very interesting, and I think that there is a lot in that can be built, but to build it, I think to really build it and to push it beyond people interested in Southeast Asia as a general problem, there's a lot of very interesting comparative studies that you could do. I suppose you could look at Europe between the wars and look at Mussolini and Franco and those sort of people, and whether they, even the Pujanis in France, and whether they sort of reflected the same sort of social and political pressures. But one particularly interesting guy is Erdogan in Turkey, who recently came out and said that he admired Adolf Hitler. I mean, he clarified it later and said, well, maybe not Hitler, but the political system in which he operated was a good system because it cleaned out sort of, the parasites and all this sort of, and established law and order. And within Turkey itself, it's interesting, he's now moving gradually to roll back the sort of liberal elements of the secular state, closing newspapers, and mobilising behind him, using Islam as a sort of, I think, as a bit of a cover, mobilising behind him very conservative peasants in the eastern part of the country, resentful of Istanbul and the liberal elites, plus a huge business community of smaller and medium-sized business. You know, it's a very complex and interesting pattern, and I think that, you know, by bringing that in, you could get a much more generic sort of proposition about what's happening in parts of Southeast Asia, and bring it out of the Southeast Asian discourse. Because that is a problem. I mean, getting an important theoretical proposition in Southeast Asia and trying to turn that into a theoretical argument that people outside the Southeast Asian community, scholarly community, will even bother to read.
Sure.
Anyway.
Yeah, thanks for that. That's I'll definitely put it high up on my to-do list. The interesting thing is, you know, when you think about some of these other cases that you mentioned, I was struck by the Philippine sociologist Randy David's phrase "dictatorships," and drawing some parallels to the interwar period, perhaps less so the National Socialists as the, as you say, fascists in Italy or elsewhere in Europe, Central and Eastern Europe. And I mean, a lot of things you could talk about. Also, there's the theatricality of Duterte's campaign, the lack of specifics, the personalistic sort of charisma, the willingness to take the heroic act to, in this case, jet ski to the Scarborough territorial waters and meet with the Chinese. I mean, this reminds one of that, I forget his name, the Italian poet who made a similar argument after the First World War in terms of lost Italian territory. Does anybody know what I'm talking about?
Yeah, I am.
Yeah, one of the precursors of Mussolini. Sorry? Yeah, anyway, I can't Google during a talk, so. Anyway, yeah, so there's, and you know, and the small business, I think, you know, you mentioned about Erdogan. I think that's right. I mean, I was very struck by the statistic that came out in Hong Kong. There are 180,000 domestic helpers in Hong Kong, Filipino domestic helpers. And according to the survey, 80% favor Duterte. And one interesting thing, if you look at domestic helpers in Hong Kong, is while they're considered, you know, at the lower end, at the lowest end of the social hierarchy, and their salaries by Hong Kong standards are very low, if you convert that into pesos, and then consider the fact that many of these women have houses in the Philippines and so on, that, you know, they have a real stake in a system which they feel endangered by, you know, this perception of growing crime and so on. They will pass through Manila and be shocked by the seeming disorder of the capital city and so on. So that, I think, is one reason for that very strong appeal. You know, if you have high economic growth without strong institutions, without strong policing and so on, that's likely to make things worse, which may well happen in the Philippines. A couple of other cases I think of, for example, in the case of Peru, Fujimori's daughter, whose name is it Katie? I forgot her first name. Also an interesting example of somebody drawing on a strong neo-authoritarian tradition, even though she's, unlike Bongbong Marcos, distanced herself a bit from that. So yeah, I think there are some generalized elements. I think the one thing about the Southeast Asian context, which I find interesting, is how that in all three cases, it's kind of, in my view, clearly come out of this disappointment with this liberal reformist agenda. And some of the, you know, people who are the strongest advocates of liberal reformism, like Chonglong, become these, you know, adamant authoritarians just a few years later. And to understand that, I think it's helpful in the Southeast Asian context. But agreed, of course, that we Southeast Asianists perhaps don't do as much as we should in terms of trying to develop concepts more generically. Thanks. Yeah, sure. If you want to look at it comparatively, the Larry Diamond sort of take, you know, there are some spots of good news. I think it's really very unclear what's going to happen in Malaysia. But, I mean, I suppose, I mean, on the one hand, I'm looking at Southeast Asia. This is, again, back to Dick's point about more generalizing, but I'm looking at it in terms of specific cases, and you could really make an interesting argument about Thailand that, well, its per capita income is higher than it needs to be to have a stable democracy. It hasn't been stable. Thailand is also remarkably ethnically homogeneous place by a lot of measures, and yet, that's supposed to be a danger for democracy, and yet that hasn't helped. On the contrary, argue it's enabled these class-based appeals, or making it made it easier for it to make them. It's so polarizing. And even, the fact that Thailand's had all these military coups in the past and so on, that it had actually seemingly overcome that, since 1976 and the end of democracy in the 1980s. Right? So, it seems to be in the last coup of 1988, 92. So it seemed to be on the right road, and if you look at the literature in the early 90s, there's a lot of optimism about Thailand. So I think if we start with the Thai case and we say, well, how come the Thai case, which seems so, promising, how come that's turned out so badly? And then we look at the Indonesian case, which actually seemed to have very poor sort of preconditions for stability, why it's done relatively well. That's where I would argue my analysis kicks in. Because I can suggest to you, well, the circumstances were such that this liberal reformist kind of narrative has been more effective in Indonesia. And as you say, Jokowi won the 2014 election. And for a while, there was again hope. Oh, wow, there's going to be reform again in Indonesia. The disillusionment didn't take long to set in, but there was that brief period of hope. And the political stability of the country seems guaranteed at least to the next election. And, this very strange case of the Philippines oscillating back and forth. So again, I would make the argument on looking at it that's on its own terms. But if you did want to make the overall comparative argument, then I would say, let's wait a little bit on Myanmar. It's very early days. And we have a supreme leader. It's a strange way to refer to Aung San Suu Kyi, but perhaps accurate. A supreme leader who's not saying the best things about the Rohingya. And
use the word.
Well,
the word is banned.
And has a rather imperious attitude toward her authority. So let's see how Myanmar turns out in the next 5 to 10 years. The issue of civilian versus military rule is not fully resolved. And Malaysia could go very bad. But of course you could make a scenario that sort of collapses and the opposition does come in. So I think in terms of how deep the democratic recession will prove to be in Southeast Asia, we have to wait a bit. But the case of Thailand is a very interesting example of something that went badly wrong. And I think that alone makes the Southeast Asia an interesting case.
Yeah. I guess my question is going to be quite straightforward in the way, Mark. I'd just like to learn a little more about the framing of the book, beyond the comparative context itself, because you began in a really interesting way, I thought, in terms of what would be a discursive bent, and using narrative, using the theatrical, and performance. And I'm just wondering about whether in the book, are you actually going to have actors, and are you going to have stages, for example? You have a neo-authoritarian stage, a reformist stage, and then who are the actors you put on the stage? Now, you put the Duterte up there. Well, then, how do you then deconstruct, or where do you go to understand the kind of statement that he made about, I'm going to jump on my jet ski, But are there signs or symbols that are salient, quintessential, that would be at the heart of a narrative on the stage? Will there be protagonists? Are you going to approach it? I guess in a way, that's where are the actors in the comparative narrative? In other words, are you going to, even in the way Ben was talking, counterpoint biographically different individuals on the stage, perhaps? I'm just trying, the way you began, I was quite excited, even with the picture of Freud up there. Beyond it, well, beyond the title, I mean, in terms of the psychosocial.
To me, that's the way there is actually a post-time. It's a radicalization, and throughout this liberal stuff, just kill the bad guys. In Thailand, my argument is that in the Philippines, in both countries, you had a clear class cleavage in which populist politicians made the successful electoral appeals. And Estrada wins easily in 1998. FPJ with virtually no machinery, very little money, almost wins in 2004, and most people think he actually was cheated in a very close race. What the difference is I was trying to get at is in the Philippines you don't have red shirts and you don't have a strong political party. So the question, so this is the way Thompson sustains, and he's less charismatic than Estrada. So how does he sustain populism despite these repeated efforts to crush it through coups and so on? Answer is he organizes a kind of quasi-social movement with this political element. People say it's just funded by Thompson. It's more complicated than that. People have done research on the red shirts quite a bit, actually. And it is got, in many ways, a genuinely social movement character. And the party is strong. The party is strong. One of the fascinating things about Thai politics was that, unlike the way it used to be, where it's similar to the Philippines, you just defect to the other side, to the stronger party. In the case of Thailand, when you would defect away from Thailand, this happened in 2008, that's how the Democrats come back into power without an election, the people who defected, Naywin was the name of this faction leader, named after the Burmese leader, by the way. Naywin is punished electorally. His party's devastated in Isan because he defected from Thaksin, and that's his punishment. So why is that? My argument is it has something to do with different socioeconomic character context. And it's easier to sustain a red shirt movement in Thailand. I mean, one fascinating thing is the way the red shirts march on Bangkok in 2010. They come in their pickup trucks. I was there. I was watching them come in. These are not dirt poor peasants. These are people with pickup trucks. These are people with resources that come in, and they're voicing their opinions. And in parts of the Philippines, the idea of people going to Manila is hard to imagine. There are parts of the whole Philippines where there are virtually they're not decent roads. There's sometimes not even electricity and so on. Much less cars and so on to transport them into the city. More difficult in archipelago, admittedly, but this kind of thing. And you could attribute to Estrada and FPJ's personalities, but I think in part it was much harder to create the sustained populist challenge that we did in Thailand, which I attribute to economic levels of economic development. And finally, the media, very important. Duterte was very reliant on the social media. People say, oh, social media is such a good thing. Well, sometimes. It's been rabidly pro-Duterte in the Philippines. And, Duterte's gotten away with a lot of stuff. I mean, this joke about the rape murder of an Australian missionary, it's really bad stuff. And the social media's been, pushing and pushing and pushing. Very important point. In the case, just talk about the Philippines for a second, the old-fashioned press is traditionally affiliated with certain political groupings, so we have the broadsheets and Manila English language, which have strong political preferences, but their importance is diminished. Generally, one speaks of, in the Philippine context, of air war versus ground war. Ground war is the traditional political machinery that supposedly people like Binay, who came in fourth, and Rojas, who came in a distant second, were strong in. And yet, as people who've been studying this for a while predicted, despite this massive machinery advantage, what really mattered was popular opinion driven by media coverage. And so it turns out the opinion polls were almost exactly accurate in predicting the electoral results. So what matters, at least at the presidential level, probably at the senatorial level as well, largely, is this media image. And this is where narratives get projected, of course, and where Duterte's theatrical style worked so well.
But doesn't that suggest that, sorry to jump in, but I mean, that whole concept, ground war and air war, that's imported from American campaigning. And we're getting if you want to do a comparison, shouldn't we be talking about Trump and Duterte? I know everyone is, but...
I have done that, yeah. I've done that. Sure, they're comparisons. There are lots of comparisons. Southeast Asia is pretty complex as it is, but I've been other comparisons going in.
I might finish here on that. I think we have to acknowledge the a tremendously impressive scope of what has been presented. But it's comparing very complex societies and drawing out themes. It's been incredibly stimulating. It's not possible without a great depth of knowledge and familiarity with the different regimes, which is, of course, a tremendous achievement in itself. But the analysis that's been presented today by Mark is so stimulating. And we could go on further, but he deserves his lunch.